In early 2019, a friend came over to my apartment, back when we could still have friends over to our apartments, and he saw my bookcase for the first time. He scanned it in silence for several minutes before he suddenly got this really grave, sad look on his face, and he went, "Oh, I can't believe you own a copy of the Fountainhead." And that got me thinking, why do I own a copy of the Fountainhead? To hear most people tell it, the Fountainhead is a bloated, self-serving tome written by a sociopathic egomaniac with a rabid neoconservative cult following. And here's the thing, I don't disagree. Part 1. Introducing Howard Roark. To figure out why I own a copy of the Fountainhead, we need to go back to 2006. The first commercial Blu-ray discs have just been released. Vice President Dick Cheney shoots someone in the face. Saddam Hussein is executed for crimes against humanity. Jacob Tremblay is born. Foreclosures jump 42% over the previous year. Pluto loses its planethood status just 7 months after NASA launches the New Horizons space probe. Disney buys Pixar. Google buys YouTube. And I am assigned to read The Fountainhead in my 12th grade high school English class. I know nothing about the book, or its author Ayn Rand before I start reading, but the story of Howard Roark has me hooked right quick. The images you'll be seeing throughout this video are from the 1949 film adaptation, which, for the most part, I won't actually be talking about today. But since it's a fairly faithful adaptation, written by none other than Rand herself, I figure it's as good a thing as any to show you while we talk about the book.
I think this is an atrocious fireplace.
Howard Roark is a ferociously independent architect who gets expelled from architectural school because he doesn't appreciate any of the old masters. Their portfolios are all purposeless copies of their own predecessors, see?
But we can't depart from the popular forms of architecture.
Why not?
Because everybody's accepted them.
I haven't.
Whereas Roark is only interested in that which is singularly unique and original, and so he strikes out on his own with one purpose in mind: to create art that he loves, without compromise, contrition, or consideration of anyone else.
Mr. Roark, we're alone here. Why don't you tell me what you think of me in any words you wish?
But I don't think of you.
But of course, none of the architectural firms of New York want to hire him, either because his designs are too modern for their tastes, or because they don't like that he's not interested in winning their approval.
If you want my work, you must take it as it is or not at all.
After a couple commissions throughout his mid-20s from like-minded clients, he's eventually forced to start over at the very bottom, quarrying rock for 68 cents a day. But eventually, he finally gets some high-profile commissions, and the elegant utility of his designs can't be denied, and so his portfolio finally starts expanding. But a lot of powerful people don't like what his work represents, in either the field of architecture or society at large, and so he's eventually targeted by bigger and bigger enemies until his career is all but ruined, at which point he starts working anonymously, on the condition that not a single stroke of his drafting pen ever be altered.
I will design Cortland. You'll put your name on it. You'll keep all the fees. But you will guarantee that it will be built exactly as I design it.
But of course, one of his designs is eventually altered without his consent, and so Roark decides to blow up a whole public housing development at night while it's unoccupied, rather than let some bastardized version of his vision come to pass. Roark is subsequently brought to trial, where he represents himself and calls no witnesses. By way of a defense, Roark simply gives an impassioned speech to the jury about the inalienable absolute right of the individual.
Now you know why I dynamited Cortland. I designed Cortland. I made it possible. I destroyed it. I agreed to design it for the purpose of seeing it built as I wished. That was the price I set for my work. I was not paid.
And is summarily acquitted.
Not guilty.
The book ends with him getting hired to design and build the world's tallest skyscraper, which he stands astride as his new wife rises to meet him in the last moments of both the book and the film.
Look at the size of my dick.
And I thought, yes, I get it. What an epic love letter to the artistic impulse, where each character in the book represents a different internalized voice within the creative development of an artist. See, the book is split into 4 parts, with each section loosely focused on a different character. The first is Peter Keating, a popular but dull architectural student who graduates at the top of his class simply by virtue of copying the so-called greats better than anyone else.
If you have seen any of these buildings.
I have. They were excellent 2,000 years ago when they were built for the first time.
Keating doesn't know why anyone likes his work, or even whether or not he's any good, but he quickly settles into a life of simply replicating his early successes as a means of getting more pats on the head.
Remember? I told you once I'd rise.
In her journals, Rand characterized Keating as the man who could never be, and didn't know it. which is just the perfect way to describe him. Keating leaned back with a sense of warmth and well-being. He liked this book. He was certain that it was profound because he didn't understand it. Keating cares more for the approval of others than he does his own, and never once recognizes that that's his whole problem.
But would you agree?
The choice is yours.
Keating represents that feeling as an artist, usually at the beginning of your creative development, where you're not really sure what you're doing, so you just start emulating your artistic idols.
I've come to beg you, as I did in school, to design it for me. To design it and let me put my name on it.
Most artists will soon develop their own styles, but God forbid you actually achieve success at this early stage, because then you'll be faced with the daunting prospect of not knowing whether or not you're actually any good, or even what you want from your own work. The second section of the book focuses on Ellsworth Toohey. You get it? Ellsworth Toohey? Worthless? Hooey? A popular newspaper editorial writer and outspoken socialist who decides that Howard Roark is a dangerous independent whose life and career need to be destroyed lest he inspire greatness in others.
Artistic value is achieved collectively, by each man subordinating himself to the standards of the majority.
To quote his most famous line from both the book and the movie,
I play the stock market of the spirit, and I sell short.
And man, do I know Toohey's voice all too well. Rand characterized Toohey as the man who could never be, and knew it.
Self-sacrifice is the law of our age.
Toohey knows he'll never be great, so he destroys anything good that comes along as a way of managing his own feelings of inadequacy, all in the name of making the world a better place. Toohey is a form of weaponized self-doubt. Toohey's voice usually pops into my head whenever I see somebody making better art than me, or whose career is doing better, which makes me wonder if I'm any good, or if I'm ever going to be appreciated in the same way. It's jealousy. Plain and simple. As I've gotten older, it's become much easier to compartmentalize those feelings, to recognize where that twinge of jealousy comes from, and to actually use it to try and better my own work. The third section of the book is about Gail Wynand, the iron-fisted owner of a popular newspaper who admires Roark's work and does his best to save his career.
It is the unsacrificed self that we must respect in man above all. And where do we find it? In a man like Howard Roark.
But ultimately succumbs to public pressure when it jeopardizes his paper.
Give in or close the banner.
You'd better give in.
All right.
Rand characterized Wynand as the man who could have been. A man who had the talent and self-confidence to create the things that made him happy, but who ultimately cared more for the approbation of the masses than his own self-worth.
I never ran the banner. They did. The men in the street. It was their paper, not mine.
For me, Wynand represents the terrible possibility that I might work for years and years, honing my craft, developing my voice, maybe even cultivating something of an actual filmography, only for no one to care. Or worse, they might hate it. The concern then is that I might change the way that I make art in an effort to try and placate a potential audience. And I mean change in a way that makes it no longer personally fulfilling. Nothing wrong with responding to feedback, but not when you're then making stuff that you no longer enjoy. Wynand makes me wonder, would a sustained negative reception to my own work ever convince me to stop making art? Like, I know I tell myself I'll never stop, because telling stories has always been something of a compulsion for me. It's how I make peace with my brain. But even when I was writing stories in the first grade with absolutely no audience, I always kind of assumed I'd have an audience eventually. At what point might I run out of steam? At what point might success become more important to me than self-actualization? I don't know. I have theories based on past experience, but I don't know. The last section of the book is entitled Howard Roark, the Man Who Is. And after poring over 3 absolute nightmare scenarios for nearly 500 pages, Roark's perspective is such a breath of fresh air for the weary artist. He's the antidote to all the other mindsets that we've covered. Roark doesn't worry about popularity, success, or what anybody thinks of him.
You know what they think of architecture?
I don't care what they think of architecture or anything else.
He can imagine projects at any budget.
No building is unimportant. I'll build for any man who wants me.
He creates art only for himself, which is the only way to create art if you're trying to avoid any of the existential sufferings that torment Keating, Toohey, and Wynand.
Is this what you want?
Good heavens, no.
Then shut up and don't ever let me hear any architectural suggestions.
When Roark works on a piece of art, he doesn't ask who's gonna like it. He doesn't even ask if it's good. He's only ever asking, do I like it? Absent any expectations that the rest of the world might put upon him and his craft. And while I certainly don't think that's the only question artists should be asking, I can't think of a better question to ask first. But wait, we're forgetting one major character, Dominique Franken, Rourke's mercurial love interest. In one of her introductory scenes, Franken describes destroying a statue simply because she liked it. Loving things makes you vulnerable, see? Makes you dependent. It's something other people can use against you, something they can take away or abuse. So of course, when she first meets Rourke, she's instantly smitten, but also keen on destroying his career. Not to mention punishing herself for loving someone so profoundly.
If I fell in love, it would be like the statue of the Greek god again.
Eventually going so far as to marry both Keating and Wynand at various points, before finally marrying Rourke in the last few pages of the novel to live happily ever after. Dominique is one of the more controversial and contrarian figures in the book. She actively works to sabotage Rourke's career, not in spite of her love for him, but because of her love for him, even going so far as to testify against him in court, but then posing as the life model for a statue to be housed inside the Temple of the Human Spirit, which Rourke designed. So she's happy to contribute to his work, while simultaneously wanting to see it destroyed. Her behavior seems rather counterintuitive until you unpack several layers of motivation. She demands perfection or nothing, and even when she does find perfection, she'd sooner see it destroyed than have it go unappreciated by the masses.
Rourke, you're everything I've always wanted. And that's why I hoped I'd never meet anyone like you. I'll give you up now myself rather than watch you being destroyed by a world where you have no chance.
It's an extremist position to be sure, and kinda hard to sympathize with, but at least it's consistent. So what does she represent in all of this? Well, the interpretation that makes the most sense to me is that Dominique Franken is an audience. The audience. The audience that loves your work, maybe even hates you a little for it, but ultimately the audience that understands your work and appreciates it for exactly what it is. Franken represents a validation that you maybe didn't need, but still feels really, really good to finally get. God, what an amazing metaphor for the creative instinct. What an incredible allegory for when you're first starting out as an artist. Filled with self-doubt and insecurity, wondering if any of your dreams are worth pursuing. How wonderful to be told, especially when you're first starting out, that you're not only allowed, but encouraged to practice art for your own self-satisfaction. To let your audience find you, instead of trying to chase one down. To create only that which brings you joy. It doesn't make the process any easier, but at least there's a clear path, and an incredibly fulfilling one at that. I always thought the ending of the book, where Rourke dynamites a public housing development and then gets off scot-free by lecturing the jury about the inalienable rights of the individual, was pretty hokey, but I get it. It's all an exercise in modern myth-making. A metaphor. I can't remember exactly when it happened, but at some point between my reading the book for the first time in high school and my friend seeing it on my shelf 13 years later, I found out that Rand did not intend it as a metaphor. None of it. She was writing real, live, idealized portraits of actual human beings that she either admired or despised. She literally believed that the only moral imperative is self-interest, that unrestricted free market capitalism was the only moral socioeconomic system, that welfare is evil, taxation is theft, and anyone who isn't rich and successful only stays that way because of their own laziness and lack of talent. Oh, and affirmative action. She thought affirmative action was holding white people back from greatness. Part 2. The Tenets of Objectivism. Before we even attempt to reconcile the tenets of the Fountainhead with the tenets of Ayn Rand, we need to go over what Ayn Rand believed in the first place. What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
Like I said, what is objectivism? In 1959, Rand gave an interview with Mike Wallace in which he outlined the basic gist of her philosophy, along with some of the real-world implications for certain social and economic policies. And I think it's pretty illustrative. Objectivism is made up of 4 main tenets, with the first 2 being objective reality and reason.
My philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it. I hold that if man wants to live on Earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute.
Okay, so reality exists as an objective absolute, and reason is our means of perceiving it. No argument there. In fact, if I have a problem with these statements, it's not that I think they're incorrect, but that they're self-evident to the point of uselessness. Like, of course reality exists as an objective absolute. Isn't that how we define reality? By that which is absolutely objective? I mean, I know there are plenty of philosophers out there who don't hold that reality is an objective absolute. Like, that's my understanding of Kant. Or Cypher from The Matrix.
Ignorance is bliss.
But you won't get any pushback from me. I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to do with that statement. Don't be irrational? Acknowledge reality? Sure. Do my best. Ayn Rand's rhetorical style reminds me a lot of someone like Jordan Peterson, R.I.P. my mentions.
Well, I like the emphasis on individual responsibility.
Where she'll say 5, 6, 7 things that you absolutely agree with, only to then hit you with some batshit leap of logic 10 steps in. Reality is objective. Reason is how we deduce reality. The US government had every right to slaughter the Native Americans.
Yeah, they had us the first half, I'm not gonna lie.
Oh, we'll get to her thoughts on the Native Americans in a bit. Right now, we're just laying the groundwork. See, I think the reason she chose reason and reality as the first 2 pillars of her philosophy isn't because so many people oppose reason and reality, but because so many people don't. That then makes it easier for her to argue in favor of the next 2 pillars of her philosophy, which generate far more controversy: selfishness and capitalism. So look, I'm not afraid of the word selfish. I know that what Rand meant when she said that was simply self-interest, and what she meant by that was that we are all entitled to, and ultimately responsible for, our own happiness.
I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy.
And I agree with that. You might say that our selves are all that anyone can ever truly be responsible for. I know we all have responsibilities outside the self, like the safety of our kids or whatever. But in the broader sense, I don't think anyone should have to give up their sense of self or their happiness on the say-so of anyone else. But see, words mean things. Rand dismissed the cruelty of sociopaths as something other than the selfishness that she described, but what else are we gonna call it? My problem with Rand's veneration of self-interest is that she proposed no mitigating factor to limit the potentially damaging effects of unrestricted selfishness, and then acted all shocked and shaken when people did terrible things for personal gain. The only mitigating factor that she proposed was a pithy disclaimer about how our happiness shouldn't impinge on anyone else's.
But that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy.
But not even she seemed to take this rule too seriously. Remember the Native Americans? Rand didn't just think that conquering the indigenous people was justified. She believed that they deserved it. The speeches that she gave on this subject tended to be long and rambly, but here's a pull quote to end all pull quotes.
Any white person who brings the element of civilization have the right to take over this country.
As New York Magazine quite succinctly summed up in 2009, Rand believed that Native Americans, having failed for millennia to create a heroically productive capitalist society, deserved to be stripped of their land. Objectivists will inevitably claim that Rand is being misunderstood or quoted out of context here, but you're welcome to follow the links that I've provided in the description of this video to go and confirm that that was indeed the main thrust of her argument. There's a whole wiki page dedicated to objectivism's rejection of the primitive, which is basically just white supremacy's greatest hits volume 12. Conversely, Rand characterized the Founding Fathers as independent industrialists who succeeded on sheer ability, without political force, help, or compulsion, when of course every grade schooler knows that the Founding Fathers were almost all born into phenomenal positions of privilege, the majority of whom owned slaves, who drafted a document that codified their privilege into law for the next 200 some odd years at the expense of every non-white, non-male, non-landowner in the country. It's this blind devotion to self-interest without any proposed check on its limits that causes Rand and so many of her modern-day proponents, like the Rand Institute and the Atlas Society, to spend so much time distancing themselves from some of Rand's biggest fans, like, for instance, Donald Trump. Ben Bayer of the Rand Institute wrote in 2019 that Trump's real problem isn't that he's selfish, but that he's not selfish. In Rand's philosophy, the truly selfish individual actually has to have a self whose interests are being advanced, and she thinks to have a self means having a core set of convictions and values that are truly one's own. Many people who are conventionally seen as selfish don't have that. I have no idea what Ben Bayer sounds like, by the way. Okay, so Trump isn't selfish. In fact, he can't be selfish because he has no self. Okay, but just so you know, that's not what anyone else means when they use the word selfish. I think a much more reliable method of tempering the potentially damaging effects of self-interest is pro-social behavior. But that's exactly what Rand despised. She thought altruism was a dirty word. From the pages of the Fountainhead, men have been taught that their first concern is to relieve the suffering of others. Then man must wish to see others suffer in order that he may be virtuous. Such is the nature of altruism. But then maybe she didn't know what that word meant either. Rand saw altruism and self-interest as polar opposites, whereas I think they work in tandem all the time. When we donate to a charity, it's only ever because that charity is trying to advance a cause that we care about. Either that or we're looking for a tax break. But my point is that pro-social behavior need not be in conflict with self-interest. Not all the time, anyway. And look, I get that Rand wrote a lot about her own philosophy, and all I've ever read is 2 of her novels. So there are probably plenty of Rand supporters out there who'll be like, well, Rand addressed your concerns in Chapter 2, Paragraph 9 of the Objectivist Code, 2nd Revised Edition. But even if that's true, this video isn't meant to be a point-by-point takedown of objectivism. I'm basically just outlining all the non-starters for me. I'm not saying you can't reconcile all the discrepancies. I'm just saying I don't have to. So finally we come to capitalism. Now I'm no economist. But neither was Rand. So, Rand was a hardline laissez-faire capitalist. She advocated for a complete and total separation of government and economics.
And you believe that there should be no right by the government to tax. You believe that there should be no such thing as welfare legislation, unemployment compensation, regulation during times of stress, certain kinds of rent controls and things like that.
That's right. I'm opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy.
God, are we really still debating the virtues of unrestricted free market capitalism in the year of our Lord 2020 AD? YouTuber Sean has some of the best takedowns of capitalism I've ever seen online, and I don't want to restate all of his arguments here, but suffice it to say that most proponents of capitalism make a lot of assumptions that don't ever really pan out in the real world, like the notion that everyone in the economy is a rational actor with the power to negotiate the best deal for themselves, that capital is readily available to anyone with a good idea, or that competition only ever breeds lower prices and better products.
I'm in the market for a low-quality, top-cost appliance.
Instead of just price fixing and deceptive marketing. Nathan J. Robinson, writing for Current Affairs in 2016, might have come up with the most succinct takedown of unregulated free markets that I've ever read. Say you come across a drowning man who begs you for a life preserver. You offer to give him one, but only in exchange for all of his worldly possessions, to which he quickly agrees. You then toss him a life preserver, and he signs over his entire net worth. You have both mutually benefited from a voluntary transaction within the free market. But someone has also been exploited by a sociopath. And whenever negative results emerge within a capitalist economy, predictably, some might even say inevitably, the capitalists all say the same thing. Oh, that wasn't capitalism. That was crony capitalism. Rand allowed for no exceptions on this point.
Study economics. A free economy will not break down. All depressions are caused by government interference. Depressions are not a result of a free economy.
Now, I'm sure there are plenty of objectivist econ majors out there who could argue all day long about how government regulation caused, for example, the Great Depression. And I wouldn't be in any position to debate them. I'm a media studies major. But what I've heard other economists say is that the crash was caused by an overinflation of stock value after a decade of unregulated consumer purchasing, followed by a failure for the government to inject enough liquidity into the market when they saw the bubble about to burst. A failure, in short, to regulate. I don't doubt that Rand would have had a comeback for that. She'd probably argue that it was government regulation in the first place that caused the initial conditions that eventually needed more regulating.
The cure is always offered, so far, to take more of the poisons that caused the disaster.
A sort of turtles all the way down approach to socioeconomics. But after so many iterations of this, we quickly reach the point of 2 cavemen fighting over a stick. And by then we're not even talking about civilization anymore. This, to me, is the great futility of Rand's socioeconomic theory. She pretends to address how whole societies should function, and yet she doesn't want pro-social behavior or government oversight to factor into it. She's proposing a world of Cro-Magnons on the honor system, which is a hell of a thing to even support, but to insist that it's the absolute best way of living ever devised is pure pole-sitting poppycock. But even if I knew absolutely nothing about the economy, which, again, film major, I immediately distrust anyone who claims that they've figured out the perfect socioeconomic system that works in absolutely every instance for everyone. Most capitalists don't even claim that. But Rand was an absolutist. Capitalism was perfection. And while I don't have any trouble conceding that capitalism is very good at doing certain things, it's absolute rarefied ballyhoo to insist that it's the perfect or even preferred system for absolutely everyone. As far as I'm concerned, the question isn't, is capitalism right? It's who is capitalism working for? And as we've all seen in the 40 years since Reagan took office and put our capitalist economy on steroids while simultaneously weakening nearly every social safety net we've ever devised, capitalism is only good for a smaller and smaller subset of the population. Like laughably small. Like so small it'd be funny if it weren't so sad. What are these stats a reflection of? The realization of some objectivist ideal, where the hardworking elites are finally able to reap the benefits of their own labor? Or is it just a bunch of unsupervised robber barons absconding with the loot? You tell me who generates all this wealth. Is it the CEOs who beg Congress for bailouts and then give themselves raises after all their stock buybacks? Or is it the workers who freeze the bottom line within a week of leaving the company? Funnily enough, Rand denounced Reagan less than a year into his presidency, based on his alignment with the religious right.
The appalling disgrace of his administration is his connection with the so-called moral majority.
But Rand died only a few months later, and Reagan went on to fill his administration with a bunch of Rand's associates who rolled back many of the government regulations and social safety nets that Rand despised. So now we have situations where the Atlas Society is writing op-eds about how Rand would have probably come around on the old Gipper if only she'd lived a bit longer. By far the most hilarious thing I read while doing research for this video was that Rand did in fact accept Social Security payments near the end of her life. Now the Rand Institute will get very defensive when you bring this up, and they have spilled a lot of ink to try and rationalize why this does not in fact make her a big, hypocritical blowhard. And the best that they've come up with is the idea that Social Security is funded by the involuntary theft of young people's wages. So to accept Social Security at the end of your life is fine, just so long as you regard it as restitution. So let me get this straight. You're allowed to accept Social Security payments, but only if you die mad about it. Part 3. The tenets of objectivism. Oh, do you see what I did there? It's like a building pun. Because buildings have tenets, and so do philosophies. Kinda. We have fun. So far, we've covered a bunch of reasons why someone might not follow objectivism, but Rand's philosophies are still massively popular. At the time of this filming, the Fountainhead has never been out of print since it was first published in 1943. So who do these philosophies appeal to? And why? Well, as I read through the list of people influenced by Ayn Rand Wikipedia page, and as I recalled conversations in high school with other kids who sparked to the Fountainhead, I noticed a couple trends. Namely, I think Rand's writing tends to appeal to two main groups: young people and rich celebrities. So what do these two groups have in common? Well, for one, they're both extremely susceptible to survivorship bias. Back in World War II, Navy researchers took a look at where planes were getting hit when they came back from their bombing runs and decided that they needed to reinforce the planes where they all tended to get hit the most. But when statistician Abraham Wald took a look at the data, he drew the exact opposite conclusion. They needed to be reinforced in all the places where the surviving planes weren't getting hit. See, by only looking at the planes that survived their bombing runs, what the Navy was actually studying was where planes could get hit and still make it home. Ergo, there were likely plenty of places where planes were getting hit that wasn't being reflected in the data, which inevitably led to a crash. My other favorite example of this kind of selection bias is the fact that whenever the government legislates new motorcycle helmet laws, hospitalizations immediately skyrocket. Not because helmets make cycling more dangerous, but because more people are suddenly surviving crashes. So what does survivorship bias have to do with celebrities? Well, as most people can plainly see, riches are often a result of privilege. If not always, then in many, if not most cases, the rich had some help along the way. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe they were born into a well-connected family, or even a family with enough money to support them while they took an unpaid internship one summer. But the simple fact remains, if you didn't get your big break by sending out unsolicited query letters on self-addressed pre-stamped postcards, you have indeed benefited from some measure of privilege in order to get where you got. And while everyone, myself included, loves to think that we all made it on our own, rich people have the most by which society tells us to measure our success. And so they're particularly susceptible to survivorship bias. Because survivorship bias is basically the statistician's way of saying not controlling for privilege. To put it another way, the rich are especially encouraged to insist that they made their success happen through whatever combination of enviable traits that they alone possess. Maybe they never quit. Maybe they worked harder than anybody else. Maybe they took more chances, had the best ideas, or put in the most hours. And they might be right about all of that. But as I said in my video about rise and grind film culture, there are plenty of people who still do all those things and still fail. Ergo, luck has more to do with success than most rich and powerful people care to admit, or even contemplate. I'm not saying these people don't work hard or aren't any good at what they do. I don't begrudge anyone in Hollywood their success. Well, most anyone anyway. But the idea that every rich and powerful person made it on their own is demonstrably false. And the few people who did build their careers from nothing don't do much to disprove the rule. Take Barbara Stanwyck, whose work I adore. She was orphaned before the age of 5 and grew up in abject poverty. She became a traveling showgirl at the age of 16 and got her big break in Hollywood at 23. By the time she was in her mid-30s, she was already the highest paid woman in the entire United States. Stanwyck was an ardent supporter of Rand and HUAC, but that's another story, and opposed many, if not all, social safety nets. She figured if she could overcome her impoverished origins without the assistance of government aid, anybody could. This is survivorship bias in action. Barbara, baby, you are the highest paid woman in the entire United States. You are literally the only person who could do what you did up until that point in history. It's pretty counterintuitive to be sure, but still well worth understanding. She thought she'd proven that anybody could achieve her level of success, when in fact all she'd really proven was that only one person ever had. This is the great appeal of objectivist philosophy, as far as the rich and powerful are concerned. It insists that their success was entirely self-generated. Just look at how Ayn Rand characterized one of Rourke's rich clients in the Fountainhead. Roger Enright had started life as a coal miner in Pennsylvania. On his way to the millions he now owned, no one had ever helped him. It's not that Rand thought all wealthy people were worthwhile, but she definitely thought all worthwhile people were wealthy. And even if the rich did receive some kind of help along the way, $1 million loan from the folks here, $300,000 in seed money there, many seem convinced that they would have succeeded eventually, with or without the help, because they're winners. That's just what winners do.
I was 27 years old. That is the time to take risks.
Well, when you have my money to bail you out, taking risks is not much of a problem, is it?
Again, I'm not saying there aren't some extremely talented celebrities out there, or that talent played no part in their success. I'm just saying... What am I saying? I'm just saying I think I need to start standing a new golden age goddess of the silver screen.
Next time, baby.
And what about young people? What do they find so comforting about Rand's philosophies? What did I find so comforting about Rand's philosophies? Well, Rand's philosophies make success feel like a recipe. She makes victory feel quantifiable, predictable, assured. Just follow these steps, keep these principles, do what all the other successful people do, and you can't not succeed. But as anyone with some measure of talent who wasn't born rich already knows, nothing guarantees success. And the one thing that predicts it better than anything else, socioeconomic privilege, is something that Rand and her modern day cohorts usually denounce wholesale. They think it doesn't exist. And that's a very comforting message when you're first starting out, when you're desperate for some sort of roadmap to success. Rand would have you believe that her philosophies are the objective truth. Literally. That's why she called it objectivism instead of like Randism or something. She wanted to make it sound inarguable, like a matter of fact, but it's not. It's prosperity gospel for atheists. So at this point, having reassessed all of Ayn Rand's beliefs in the years since I first self-identified as a fan of the Fountainhead, there's only one thing left to do. Part 4. The Great Fountainhead Reread. In preparation for this video, I started rereading The Fountainhead for the first time in 8 years. The last time had been back in 2012, when I was 23, not 2 years graduated from college, having already crashed and burned out in LA, unemployed and broke, back in my hometown. Not feeling great about life in general. I felt like Howard Rourke when he was at rock bottom, performing menial work for basically no pay, having to bide his time until he finally had the resources to put his talents to good use. And at the time, I found it to be a very comforting read, for many of the same reasons that I found it comforting in high school. What surprised me the most as I started my latest reread is that I hadn't actually thought about rereading it in all the years since I first joined the workforce. So how does it hold up? So as not to sound too unbalanced, I'll start with the positive. I still like the plot. The story of an architect whose uncompromising vision clashes with the contemporary fashions and bloviating personalities of his profession is a good one, I think. It's fun to see Roark do his work so well and then laugh in the faces of the stodgy doofuses who'd seek to oppose him. He takes everything to the extreme, of course, refusing to modify his designs even if it means losing the entire commission. But the point he makes about the importance of self-interest within artistic pursuits is a powerful one. It also doesn't hurt that Roark practices one of my all-time favorite architectural styles. Rand refused to give it a name, but she cited Frank Lloyd Wright as the primary inspiration, and he designed some absolutely gorgeous buildings, y'all. Something about them just makes sense. They're not trying to impress anyone, they're just trying to work, which is, of course, a big part of what makes them so impressive. Roark's idea of a fulfilling career is also pretty much exactly how I describe it. I have, let's say, 60 years to live. Most of that time will be spent working. I've chosen the work I want to do. If I find no joy in it, then I'm only condemning myself to 60 years of torture, and I can find the joy only if I do my work in the best way possible to me. Rock on, man. But then my knowledge of Rand's beliefs finally started to get in the way of my enjoyment of the story. For one thing, I think the plot only works on any level precisely because the stakes are so low. All that's at stake is one man's career. And even if his career is a stand-in for his soul or whatever, that's still just one man's soul. Why should that matter to anyone but him, since he's ultimately the only one responsible for it? The only thing he ever jeopardizes is himself, and he's got every right to do that.
I don't need it.
But I want to help you.
I don't give or ask for help.
So who cares if he wants to design buildings only exactly as he sees fit? Who cares if he's willing to lose the commission of a lifetime in the name of good taste? Let him dynamite his own career. Let us all dynamite our own careers for the sake of artistic integrity, just so long as we're talking about a simple architectural preference. If we're talking about how whole governments should run, suddenly a lot of these behaviors seem a lot less silly and a lot more monstrous. When I hear the phrase Howard Roark architect, I think, good for him. But when I hear Howard Roark president, my blood runs cold. For what it's worth, I think this is why I couldn't get through even the first chapter of Atlas Shrugged, even back when I self-identified as a Rand fan. Because that story is explicitly about how the whole world should run, and made me feel super icky to think like that. But at least it gave us Bioshock.
Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
Then came one of the single biggest changes from my last reread of the book. I suddenly couldn't tell the difference between the primary antagonist, Ellsworth Toohey, and the secondary protagonist, Gale Winand. That's the guy who tries to destroy Roark from the outset, and the guy who helps Roark for a little while before finally bailing on him in the last act. Both men make a point of being petty, vindictive assholes to anyone they don't like. They're both contrarian control freaks who like watching other people suffer. The only difference that I can tell is that Toohey thinks suffering is righteous, or at least he claims it's righteous, whereas Winand is just an egotistical sadist. Toohey grinds people into dust under the pretense of making the world a better place, whereas Winand does it out of pure spite.
I grant you that I'm behaving abominably. It's extremely cruel to be honest.
And yet Rand seems to think that their motivations alone determine the morality of their behavior. The context, or even the effects of their behavior, goes largely ignored. Doesn't matter how cruel they are, or to whom, or even why. All Rand wants to know is whether you thought you were being altruistic when you did it. Then the wheels finally came off the wagon. I got about 2/3 of the way through the book before I just stopped. Right about when Dominique decides to become Gale Winand's mistress. I can't tell you exactly why that happened, but I know that once I reached that point I could see the rest of the plot laid out before me, and I didn't like what I saw. Also, my friend sent me a copy of The Dinosaur Artist by Paige Williams in the middle of my reread, and I really want to start it. What follows is nearly 200 pages of little more than Dominique's contrarian self-torture and Winand's conceited navel-gazing, before Roark finally dynamites his own housing project and then gets off scot-free by lecturing the jury about the inalienable rights of the individual, which was always the part of the story that just never worked for me. Even if I believed everything that Rand had to say about individualism, I'd never assume that everyone else could be convinced simply by hearing about it. If you want to watch a great film about jury nullification, go see The Verdict, or To Kill a Mockingbird. Hell, even A Time to Kill is tense, whereas The Fountainhead doesn't even tell you what opposing counsel has to say. You know, I didn't start scripting this video with the goal of trying to figure out how I would adapt The Fountainhead to film. I kinda went in assuming I never would, but then an idea popped into my head and I find it kinda delightful. I wouldn't make Roark the villain or anything, which I know a lot of people have suggested. It seems a little dishonest, or maybe just too easy. No, what I would do If I absolutely had to adapt the Fountainhead to film, would be to film the novel pretty much as is, but with one critical difference. Nobody gets to explain their reasoning for any of their behavior. Rand wasn't in the news when I decided to make this video. She wasn't trending, it's not supposed to be timely. It literally just won a poll that I put up on Patreon. But Rand has been one hell of a thing to study in the midst of a global pandemic. It's not that I think her philosophy is so shocking. After all, greed and self-interest have been around for a lot longer than she has. What surprises me is that so many objectivists seem surprised at the negative reception to her work. To return to the example of a drowning victim, Rand would have you believe that if you came across a drowning person, you'd be under no moral obligation to try and save them. Which, sure. I'm not gonna want someone arrested for failing to intervene. That only ends with all of us in jail. I'd probably assume that I just don't know the whole story anyway. Maybe they can't swim so good. Maybe they've already tossed out one life preserver and they want to hold on to their spare. Maybe they just don't care, and I wouldn't expect to be able to force them to. But if you're gonna withhold your aid until you deign to figure out how to make it sufficiently profitable for you to save someone else's life with the help of your leftovers, you're welcome to insist that that's your prerogative. But it is then society's prerogative to tell you to go fuck yourself. Look, for all her talk about being the most singularly consequential thinker who ever lived, who owed but a small acknowledgement of a debt to Aristotle, Rand was little more than a racist windbag who wrote 2 bestsellers and then promptly retired to become a professional explainer of her own convoluted contrarian philosophy for the rest of her life. She monetized a lack of empathy. That's it. Like, that's our whole grift. And while any of us might be a little short of empathy on any given day, most of us don't expect to be paid for it. For all her talk about having deduced the absolute perfect system by which all society should run, her whole ideology basically boils down to this reactionary, self-serving, knee-jerk response to the creeping, all-consuming fear that someone, somewhere, was touching her stuff. She measured worth in wealth and whiteness, and thought nothing of stealing from other races and cultures in order to get what she wanted. She compared anything she didn't like to slavery, and yet when it came to actual slavery, she was more than happy to let things slide. For all her talk of rights, all she really cared about was ability. Her ability, not yours. And the only reason she's remembered for being a mere asshole instead of an actual monster is because she never got a hold of any real political power. Does any of that make the book worth shredding? Well, no. I don't think so. I'm not in favor of book burnings. In case there was ever any doubt. I still think anyone who wants to should be able to read it. If we destroyed every book with a problematic author or ideology, even this shelf would be looking pretty sparse. Ender's Game was written by an unrepentant homophobe. Michael Crichton, while not an outright climate change denier, was still quite the apologist for the movement as a whole. David Mamet thinks that whenever one of his plays does well, it's a result of the free market, and whenever one of them doesn't do well, it's a conspiracy of silence perpetuated by the liberal media. H.P. Lovecraft. I don't even have to say what his problem is, but I think it's important to read and even reread books that don't necessarily line up with our worldviews. Not just sometimes, but regularly. The Fountainhead helped me figure out a lot of what I believe over the last several years, and for that, I can't resent the fact that it exists. That's how art works. Just don't fall for the marketing. Nobody needs objectivism. It's not even a century old. People were figuring out how to be happy long before Ayn Rand, and they'll continue to do so long after the Fountainhead is finally out of print someday. But once you're done with Rand, go read some Vonnegut. Carl Sagan, Mary Roach, K.A. Applegate, Joseph Heller, Lindy West, Octavia Butler, Andy Weir, Mary Shelley, Howard Zinn, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Why do I own a copy of the Fountainhead? I honestly hadn't thought about it since the last time I read it. Funnily enough, Rand denounced Reagan less than a year into his pregnancy. Jesus Christ. Rand denounced Reagan less than a year into his pregnancy.